Well, welcome back. We've been on a long hiatus. It's been a minute, as the kids say. That's what the kids say.
That's what they say.
It's been a minute since we've been together for Words with Friends. But we're starting a new 5-week series. This one is on the character of God. We're going to look at the words in this passage from Exodus 34. But to start this, what I want to talk about is stories. So what were the stories for you guys that you remember as a kid that were really engrossing to you, that you just were like, I want to hear that. Maybe you want to read it or watch it over and over again. What were those stories for you, Luke?
I was always intrigued by war stories. I really loved like World War II. And it came from different aspects. So I learned about it in school, but then growing up playing video games, right? One of the first games I played was a World War II based game, which then got me more interested about it. And so, yeah, I love going to like museums and hearing, like especially if they bring in veterans, just like getting to hear their stories about it. It just
There's something about a gifted storyteller that if they can pull you in, you'll never forget some of those things. What about you, Leah? What were your favorite stories growing up?
I have two, and it's kind of two different times of my life. So one is children's stories, specifically Zelensky's Rumpelstiltskin. I still love that book to this day, and it's not even a lighthearted story.
Right.
Like it's dark.
Right.
But I just find the story itself really fascinating, and the illustrations in that book are just beautiful. And then the second one was later in probably middle school. We learned about the Holocaust, and all of those stories just resonated with me, and I find them so fascinating and also just so heart-wrenching. So I can't stop reading them and looking at pictures. And
it's funny how when you think about your childhood, stories were all over the place. In the movies that we watched, the story, that long epic story of Star Wars that is just now finishing up, the storybooks that we read. I can remember going to my earliest memory of being like 3 years old in my mom's Sunday school class, and she had a little sandbox diorama and all the little different stories. And I remember all of those stories. I also remember some of those stories through song, and they've just stayed with me my whole life. What about now, as we get older? What are the stories that really engage us? For me, everyone I think knows this about me, it's those heartwarming stories. It's the ones of people going out of their way in unexpected places to do really above and beyond kind of things that really take your attention. Stories of triumph, stories of overcoming. Those are the ones that I want to read about and hear about now.
I think it's kind of like the story of the underdog.
Yeah.
Whether it be like sports or just in life, I think those are probably the most engaging to me now.
Yeah, I agree. Someone overcoming something, or someone helping someone go through something.
So why are stories so, I don't want to say the word important, why do they work? What is it about stories that stick with us? What you're going to see here in this video is how the Old Testament is this epic story, and they do this beautiful job of putting it all together and weaving these themes. You're about to see a great video, one of my favorites so far. But why is it this? Why isn't it just the information? We're less interested that the Norman Conquest happened in 1066 than if we told you the story of William the Conqueror.
Right.
So what is it about stories? Are we wired that way? What do you think it is?
Yeah, I think what keeps me engaged is a plot twist. I think that's what always
you see dead people.
That's the kind of thing that keeps me coming back for more stories, because I'm one of those people that I try to figure out the end before it comes, and then when it's just nowhere near what I was thinking, that's what's like, oh man, tell me something else that's like this, that has this huge plot twist.
I think for me, I tend to put myself in the story. So any story that has a person that I can relate to, even remotely, keeps me hooked.
Jesus said he taught with stories because very complex things can be made simple. But I also think there's an element of, I'll never forget that plot line. If you start to look for it, by the way, you'll find stories everywhere, even in advertising. The best advertising tells a story about why you need to take this drug or buy this thing. It tells you, think of the McDonald's commercials, or I hate to say it, Super Bowl's coming up, all the beer commercials of a dog or horses out playing football.
Right.
It's never made me want to buy beer, but I do remember the stories. All right, so let's watch this, and we're going to come back and break it all down.
The Bible is a collection of many ancient Israelite scrolls. And together, they're telling one unified story.
Now, if you look at the second scroll, Exodus, you'll find two important sentences. They're actually so important that they're referenced and re-quoted over 20 more times within the Bible itself.
It must be important. What does it say?
Yahweh, Yahweh, that's God's name, a God compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, overflowing with loyal love and faithfulness.
I can see why it's repeated so often. These attributes of God are really lovely.
And the statement goes on. He maintains loyal love for thousands, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. Yet he won't declare innocent the guilty. He will bring the iniquities of the fathers upon the children and grandchildren to the third and the fourth.
Okay, hold on. This last part takes a bit of a turn. We're first talking about God's love, and suddenly it's about his judgment on grandkids? So, is God merciful or vengeful?
Yeah, great question. Let's see these words in a larger context by looking at something important in Genesis, the first scroll of the Bible. There, God chooses one family, the Israelites, from among the nations, and he promises that he's going to rescue the whole world through this family somehow.
And Genesis ends with the family of Abraham in Egypt.
Then the book of Exodus begins, and this book has two large movements.
Right, okay, so this first movement of Exodus, God rescues Israel from slavery in Egypt.
And in the second movement, God leads them to Mount Sinai, where they camp out for a year. And God invites this whole nation into a partnership called a covenant, so that they can be shaped by his values and character.
And represent God to all the other nations.
Exactly. Now, this whole Mount Sinai movement in Exodus can be broken up into 4 literary units. First, there's the actual ceremony where the Israelites agree to be God's partners. And God sets up the terms of the relationship, starting with the 10 commandments. The first 2 are,
don't give your allegiance to other gods, and don't make any idol images of God. Seems simple enough.
After that, God shows Moses detailed blueprints for building this sacred home so that God can come and live among them.
Oh, right, and then comes a really long narrative about the building of that sacred home.
But you missed something. Right in between these sections is the story that has our description about God's character. The story begins with Moses going up on the mountain, writing down the partner agreement, as the Israelites are at the base of the mountain, violating the first 2 commands.
That's ridiculous. They're breaking the covenant vows while the ceremony is still going on.
Yes. And so God is hurt and angry, and he warns Moses that this betrayal will keep on happening. God is ready to call it quits.
But what about his promise to rescue the world through them?
Yeah, exactly. This is what Moses brings up. And so, what is God going to do? Should he end the partnership, which would be fair?
Or will he be faithful to his promise to Abraham and show them mercy?
Yeah, exactly. Now, look back at the words that we began with, and you'll see they're about this very tension between God's mercy and his justice.
Okay, so the statement opens like this: a God compassionate and gracious.
In Hebrew, this line has 3 words that rhyme. El Rahum V'Chanun. And the line, overflowing with loyal love and faithfulness, matches the first, as it also has 3 Hebrew words. Rav Chesed V'Emet.
Each of those lines have 2 attributes of God, and they surround a 5th attribute, that God is slow to anger.
Right. Now, that's the first half of this description of God. Then comes the second half. God maintains loyal love for thousands. And how is he going to remain loyal to people who keep rebelling against him? By forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin.
But God's forgiveness doesn't mean people can just do whatever they want.
Right. God's mercy is balanced in what follows. Yet he won't declare innocent the guilty. He'll bring the iniquities of the fathers upon the children and grandchildren to the third and the fourth.
The third and the fourth what?
Well, it's referring to generations of people who repeat their ancestors' rebellion against God. They'll get what they deserve. But notice, this small number of generations contrasts that massive number up above.
God's loyal love to thousands.
Right. And then check this out. God's forgiveness of iniquity in this line is contrasted with his justice on iniquity in this line.
Okay, and all those lines are surrounding a central line here about God's justice. He will not declare innocent the guilty. So while God is slow to anger, he is also just.
Right. This is the tension that these 2 sentences are exploring. How does a faithful and loyal God deal with such a rebellious people? This is the challenge God faces in this story, and it's the same challenge he faces in the whole biblical story as he works to rescue the world through this family.
With that in mind, we can take a closer look at these 5 attributes that God declares about himself to Moses. A God compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, overflowing with loyal love and faithfulness.
And we'll see how each one leads us deeper into the character of God and into the story of the Bible.
So I want to know from you guys, that's a lot of material to digest, and I know we're going to spend the next 5 weeks kind of taking it beat by beat and word by word, but what was your major takeaways? What were your major impressions from watching that?
I like how when it breaks it down, it says, everything has its opposite, right? He's loving and compassionate, but then you can see where that will turn into judgment, right? For everything, it's a balance, and it really shows that. I
liked the connections, that this isn't just one story for one time. It's quoted all throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament.
Right.
That there's an overarching story. So there's all these, and then for him to say, well, it starts with coming out of Egypt, and then it's the sacrifice, and then it's the tabernacle, and I don't know. It just makes it. I feel like I know more about the Old Testament right now than I did 6 minutes ago. So that's good. Let's go with this passage. Leah, you want to read it for us? Exodus 34, 6-7.
The Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the 3rd and 4th generation.
And so there's actually some great material that we ought to tell them about, Luke, that you can go into the Bible Project and find way more detailed notes than what we're going to do, kind of at a college level dissection of all of these passages. But the one that really I was interested in it was, where does that show up in other places?
Right.
And mostly in the Psalms.
Yes.
So when the psalmists wanted to describe God, they go back to this language. And I'll give you one. This is Psalm 145. 3-9. Great is the Lord and most worthy of praise. His greatness no one can fathom. One generation commends your works to another. They tell of your mighty acts. They speak of the glorious splendor of your majesty. And I will meditate on your wonderful works. They tell of the power of your awesome works. And I will proclaim your great deeds. They celebrate your abundant goodness and joyfully sing of your righteousness. The Lord is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and rich in love. The Lord is good to all. He has compassion on all he has made. All right. So the central question you always want to ask when you're reading the Bible, any section of the Bible, is, what does this teach us about God? What do we learn about God here? So I'm going to ask you guys, what do we get? What do we know now about God that maybe we didn't know before?
I think it goes back to, kind of how it ended. God is good to all, right? Yeah. He has compassion for all he's made. And I think that is what you have to keep in mind when we start reading later, when we start reading about the slow to anger, right? And in all things, God is good to all, right? He has the compassion for who he's made. However, don't let that be like, oh, God's going to be good to me, whatever, so I can just live however I want.
Yes.
So I think that's kind of what I got from that.
I also picked up that it's telling a story about telling stories. We're singing of his things. We're telling of his mighty acts. We're speaking of his glorious splendor. We're singing. We're continuing to tell all that he has done, all of his awesome works. So I thought that was cool too, that you're reading about this, kind of like, was it The Princess Bride and the Never-Ending Story, where you're reading about the story that you're in, or you're a part of this.
Right.
What else about God, Leah? What do we learn about his character?
Well, I think the phrase that stuck out to me the most after watching the video was that this whole passage is about the tension. Like, God's love is overwhelming, but it doesn't mean he's going to overlook the things that you do.
Right. He's slow to anger. He's not.
Right. It doesn't mean he doesn't
without
anger.
Yeah, he's without anger. Right.
And that really resonates with me, because I don't think I thought of it as tension before. Like, I just thought, well, he loves me, but then he gets angry with me. It's a flip-flop type of thing, as opposed to it's constant. Like, his love is constant, but that it doesn't mean that along the way he isn't going to be angry and seek justice for the things that happen.
Okay, so if you want to take a really deep dive into this passage and, I mean, really break it down into its parts, set it against John 1. And we all know John 1, the beginning was the Word, and the Word was the flesh. I'm going to have Luke read just a part of it here. But there was an amazing amount of parallels and crossovers. Of course, because Jesus, I don't want to give spoiler alert, Jesus is the representation of God's character.
Man.
Right.
So, all right, give us John 1, 14 through 18, Luke.
The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testified concerning him. He cried out, saying, "This is the one I spoke about when I said, 'He who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me.' Out of his fullness we have all received grace in place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Christ Jesus. No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship to the Father, has made him known."
All right, so there's the parallels, right? This idea of the glory of God. And, Moses' interaction with God was one that was terrifying.
Right.
So much so that he comes down from the mountain and they're like, put something over your face because the reflective glory of God is too much for us to see.
Right.
And we remember that he says, "Oh, I want to see you." And God says, "No, go stand in the cleft, the corner of this rock, and I'll kind of pass by." And just a little bit of his glory is amazing. So there's that. And then I love it. It says, no one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is the closest relationship to the Father. So if we want to know what God is and who God is, we need to look at Jesus. I thought one of the things that's missing there in John is that idea of punishment, the idea of judgment. Although you could say that goes along with the glory of God, that if we saw him, we would be terrified. It would be a terrible, terrifying instance for us. So let's talk about this. I love, Leah, you kind of introduced it. The justice and mercy, the compassion and the judgment, they're all found together in God. And what do we do with that? So how do you balance those out? How do you balance out justice and mercy?
Yeah, that's
the question.
That's difficult. You don't want to be seen as the pushover, but then again, you don't want to be seen as the iron fist,
right.
I guess. And I think when we look at our relationship with God and we look at the relationship with Jesus, we want to see the overpouring of forgiveness and grace without the, oh yeah, and we're going to have to talk about this later.
Well, there can be no mercy without justice, without judgment.
Right.
Because if you're receiving mercy, what would I be receiving mercy for?
No
What I'm due, what I'm owed, what the recompense for what I've done. And we're going to talk about generational sin and all kinds. Not today, but we're gonna talk about this idea of God both judging and being compassionate. And it's like he gives them out with both hands. Which would you rather have, mercy or justice? It's a trick question, so just go ahead and try to answer it.
Yeah.
I think it depends on what side of the
go ahead.
mistake you're
Why?
on.
Why?
Well, because if you are the one that has made the mistake, you obviously want mercy. But if you're the one who has been wronged, then you want justice.
I want justice for all of my enemies.
Yes.
I want mercy for most of my friends.
Right.
Not all of them, because some of them park in front of my house. You want... You're right. When you approach the system, the justice system, you're hoping for some kind of mercy. But when you're bringing people to the justice system, you're hoping for throw the book at them.
Right.
Give me what I'm owed. Give me what I'm due. Jeremiah 32. I prayed to the Lord, sovereign Lord, you've made the heavens and the earth by your great power and outstretched arm. Nothing is too hard for you. You show love to thousands, but bring the punishment for the parents' sins into the laps of their children after them. Great and mighty God, whose name is the Lord Almighty. Great are your purposes and mighty are your deeds. Your eyes are open to the ways of all mankind. You reward each person according to their conduct and as their deeds deserve. What do you hear there? Is he just or is he merciful?
What scares me is he rewards each person according to their conduct, which means your reward could not. Usually, when we hear reward,
Right.
it's I won something. This is a reward.
No.
Well, this is saying your reward for your conduct could be bad.
Yeah.
It reminds me of Jesus saying, the measure you use will be measured to you. If you're not merciful,
Right.
then you will not receive mercy.
Yeah.
But I also read, and I promise it'll be a later lesson when we get into this idea of punishing through generations. And I loved how the notes described this idea of saying, if you learned bad behavior from your parents, you're not off the hook for the bad behavior. You can't say, oh, this is in my DNA, or I'm just redheaded, or this is
Right.
that's how I was raised.
Right. Yeah.
No.
And he says, no. Your decisions, your choices are your choices. And part of becoming an adult, I would say part of becoming more Christ-like, is figuring that out, of saying, my parents did this, I'm going to do that. In any marriage, Luke, you have to decide. There's certain habits that you learn from watching your parents. We can't help. And you've got to make a decision. Are you going to repeat those habits, or are you going to start your own habits? I'm going to give two stories to close. One is one of my favorite C.S. Lewis quotes. And Luke, I'd like for you to read this in a British accent. You don't have to read it in a British accent, but just give us a little bit. This is a chapter on forgiveness in Mere Christianity, which is a wonderful book. But go ahead.
For a long time, I used to think this a silly straw-splitting distinction. How could you hate what a man did and not hate the man? But years later, it occurred to me that there was one person to whom I've been doing this all my life, namely myself. However, much I might dislike my own cowardice or conceit or greed, I went on loving myself. There had never been the slightest difficulty. In fact, the very reason why I hated the things was that I loved the man.
Well, there's a lot there.
Yeah.
Right? He's saying, I never could reconcile this idea of hating the sin and loving the sinner, but then I realized I do this all the time. I put up with my own lousy behavior because I love the person.
Right.
And I wonder if there's a parallel there, or a lesson there, of Jesus saying, love your neighbor as much as you love yourself. As much mercy as you want and require for you from God, you ought to extend and give to other people. Even your enemies.
Right.
Even people that vote different than you, or sin different than you. You ought to give them as much mercy as you require. And then we'll close. This is one story. Whenever you said World War II, this is a World War II story. But whenever I think about forgiveness and mercy, I think about the story of Corrie ten Boom, and in her book, The Hiding Place. As many of you know that book or have seen the movie. It talks about her experiences in a concentration camp. And I'll just read this to you, and we'll kind of close here. One of the most powerful prayers in the midst of suffering I have read was uncovered from the horrors of Ravensbrück concentration camp. Ravensbrück was a concentration camp built in 1939 for women. Over 90,000 women and children perished in Ravensbrück, murdered by the Nazis. Corrie ten Boom, who wrote The Hiding Place, was imprisoned there. The prayer found in the clothing of a dead child says this. Hear this. O Lord, remember not only the men and women of goodwill, but also those of ill will. But do not remember all the suffering they've inflicted upon us. Instead, remember the fruits we have borne because of this suffering. Our fellowship, our loyalty to one another, our humility, our courage, our generosity, the greatness of heart that has grown from this trouble. When our persecutors come to be judged by you, let all these fruits that we have borne be their forgiveness. I don't have space in my head or my heart to process that, to think of the most despicable, horrible cruelty. I'm having a hard time then going to the Lord and saying, but just judge them based on what it did for us.
Right.
That's an amazing thought. Any closing thoughts? Anybody want to get a last word in here?
Yeah, I would just say, going back to the idea of, C.S. Lewis, and then here, think about how other people can look at you and say, is this a person that I want to be as well?
Yeah.
If they're trying to live Christ-like and I'm trying to live like them, because I think it is easy to give ourselves so much grace, but we have to remember that people are watching us give ourselves that grace
Right.
when we mess up, and then they also watch us when we cast judgment on others.
And just because, I'm sorry, you had the last word. And just because there's grace and mercy doesn't mean that we throw out the standard.
Right.
No.
That it's the standard that tells us we need grace and mercy.
Right.
Boy, that's rich stuff. Hey, the next 5 weeks, we're going to talk about him being slow to anger, abounding in love, compassionate, all of those great things. So join us next week.